It is my pleasure to introduce today's program. Someone everyone here knows, a long-standing member of this club and a devout advocate for veterans in our area. So it is my pleasure to welcome our own Gary Clark.
Thanks, Jack. I haven't been here 100 years, but sometimes it feels like it. Happy day after Memorial Day, and I hope everybody had a chance to reflect a little bit on what that means, and if you'll excuse me, I'm going to a little bit here in the presentation I'm going to make today. 50 years ago today, we were heavily engaged in Vietnam in a campaign that was probably some of the most bloody that we ever experienced. But I'm going to go back and I'm going to talk a little bit about Vietnam from the beginning very, very quickly. And then I'm going to put some personal faces to that conflict. And if you'll excuse me a little bit, I'm going to talk about some of the friends that I had that didn't come back and reflect a little bit on that, since it is the Memorial Day season. So with that, in my estimation, from looking at the history of the United States, there's been 4 transformative events that have occurred. One, obviously, is the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Revolutionary War, and one could also add, we had to fight that war twice. The second time was the War of 1812. The combatants were the same, the British, and to gain our independence and to put forth the idea of self-governance. The second was the Civil War. With the Civil War, with 600,000 plus casualties killed in that war, we really wrote in blood the promises of the Declaration of Independence, that all were created equal. And then came World War II. And World War II really transformed this country in several ways. One is it made the United States a world leader, and secondly, it redefined the workforce. Women, for the first time, were engaged in just about every aspect of work life out of necessity, and that continued. But the third was Vietnam. And Vietnam is still with us today in many ways. I would argue that what we see happening today had its origins back in Vietnam, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. War breaks down into really 2 components. One is those who make the decisions, and secondly are those who execute those decisions. I'm going to talk a little bit about both. And then I'm also going to answer the question that's burning in everybody's mind. Why do you go to a bar? And we'll talk about that too. Those who make the decisions. One could argue, and with some significance in that argument, that the war in Vietnam actually began after World War II, World War I. Some of you, if you read your history books, and this is the history books as it actually existed, not as some of the history books are written today. It goes back to World War I, when Woodrow Wilson, following World War I, issued his 14 points. Well, the 5th point in that had to do with self-determination. Prior to 1950, Vietnam was known as French Indochina. Ho Chi Minh met with Wilson in Paris in 1918 and asked that the same principles be applied to French Indochina. He was ignored. And from that point on, Ho Chi Minh had one objective in mind: the reunification of Vietnam through the use of through the Viet Minh independence movement. And today, if you visit Vietnam, Uncle Ho is still looked at as the father, the George Washington, if you will, of Vietnam. And his ideas for Vietnam was espoused by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, and they fought for that cause. The second is General Giap. Some would argue that he was probably one of the most brilliant military strategists of that time. His whole life was involved in war. And he, from being the leader of the Vietnam men during World War II to the First Indochina War against the French from 1946 up through the Dien Bien Phu in 1956, the Vietnam War. He was the leader of the military through all that period. He lost most of the battles that he had, including the tail offensive. He lost most of the battles that we fought. Very few battles did we lose. But as several of the leaders, including General Japp, mentioned later, it didn't matter. He won the war. And in part, he had the American medium as an asset, as an ally in that. And I'll talk about that in a second, too. He also, after 1975, he led the incursion into Cambodia. And Cambodia at the time was ruled by the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, and you remember the atrocities that went on there. He drove the Khmer Rouge out, and the Chinese, in response, invaded Vietnam, and he defeated the Chinese, drove the Chinese out of Vietnam as well. So you can take what you want from some of those events. If you look here, here's 1945. He's helped us, both Japp and Ho Chi Minh helped us as part of the OSS, which was the forerunner to the CIA during that period of time. Helped us in the Far East in prosecuting the war against the Japanese. Trivia question: which member of this club served in the OSS during World War II? Jack, you can't answer. Anybody know? Todd?
Henry McIntosh?
Henry McIntosh. Dr. McIntosh served in the OSS during World War II. That's one for the history books there. Let's talk about Kennedy a little bit. When John Kennedy came in as president, we started the ramp up in Vietnam. Around 400 advisors in May of 1961. His Secretary of Defense, which I'll talk about in a second, wanted to go to 200,000 into Vietnam almost immediately. He supported Diem. Diem was a corrupt leader who had very little control outside of Saigon. He was a Catholic in a land of largely Buddhists, and he had very little control over anything outside of Saigon. And in 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated, we had at that time 16,000 troops in Vietnam. The question that's been asked several times is, would Kennedy have continued on the course that was taken? Would he have continued to add forces to Vietnam, and would the war have been prosecuted in much the same way? My argument to that is I think he probably would have. And there's three reasons why I come to that conclusion. First of all was the Bay of Pigs fiasco. What he learned from that was, if you make a commitment, you better follow through on it. And he made a commitment to the Bay of Pigs and then sort of pulled out, and the forces were left to their own devices. The second reason is, in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he had come away with somewhat of a success. He had stared down Nikita Khrushchev in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And from that, I think he learned that to remain resolved in what you're attempting to do. And the third reason is he had a Secretary of Defense known as Robert McNamara. Robert McNamara, nothing against accountants here, nothing against accountants, but Robert McNamara was an accountant, okay? He went to Berkeley and Harvard. There's two strikes right there. And then he went to Price Waterhouse as an accountant, okay? He then went back to teaching accounting at Harvard, okay? He joined the Army Air Corps in about 1943. In his job there, he worked in the Office of Statistical Control. It's easy for someone to say. And supporting the 20th Bomber Command. Okay, what was the 20th Bomber Command doing? The 20th Bomber Command was operating in the Pacific. And at that time, we had B-29s that were attacking the Japanese homeland. And it was Robert McNamara's job to help plan the bombing missions with an estimate of how many civilian casualties each mission would entail. And so that was where that was his job in World War II. Following that, he went to work for Ford Motor Company, and then he was selected as Secretary of Defense for President Kennedy. He brought in with him, and some of these guys were accountants too. Nothing negative about you accountants out there, but he brought in these so-called whiz kids, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Of course, President Kennedy was followed by President Johnson. And President Johnson believed strongly in the theory, the domino theory, that if Vietnam fell, then so would go Cambodia, Laos, perhaps Thailand, Indonesia, etc. That was the theory he was operating on. He basically adopted a no-win policy. We weren't there to win; we were there to sort of try to stabilize, and we'll mention that in a second too. I won't say much about this, but these are two people that had pretty significant influence on the media at that point. The media found them very interesting to highlight, and we'll move on. Here's another couple of folks that had influence. See, what happened is, for those of you that remember that period of time, the media got very enamored with the things that were going on at that time. With folks who were objecting to the Vietnam War, particularly after 1968. They got very enamored, and those of you that remember, and I remember Bill Ayers leading 100,000 of his closest friends in their attack on the Pentagon in 1967, and almost got in, did do substantial damage. They also bombed the New York Police Department headquarters. The Weather Underground then also went on and attacked the U.S. Capitol. And for all their efforts, they improved their resume, so they got teaching jobs at the University of Illinois and other places. And that's why I say, in part, what we're seeing today in some of our colleges and universities, and some of the products of some of those, had its beginnings back in this period of time, during this period of these folks who were leading the protest march against that. You'll notice that Florida wasn't excluded. You notice the seal back there? Anybody recognize that? Florida State University. Ayers was invited to speak at Florida State University in 2009. Okay? I would submit to you that very seldom do military officers get the opportunity to speak at colleges or universities, public colleges or universities. So here's some of the considerations that were made. One is the domino theory, and that was the prevalent theory, the idea at the time. The second was the fear that if we massively use force in Vietnam, that very possibly we would invite incursion from China or the Soviet Union, who we considered to be supporters as they were. But the question is, how far would they support? And plus, we had forces at the time that were designed mainly for a European land conflict. They weren't really designed for the types of insurgency operations that we had in Vietnam. And we really didn't understand the enemy that well. None of the training that I had, we ever talked about understanding the enemy. We just knew they were bad, and we had to try to kill them. The final thing was, what was the mission? What were we trying to do? I know when I came home, my dad said, what are we trying to do? And I just had to say, Dad, I have no earthly idea what we're trying to do. We take a hill one day, we give it back the next. And he was a product he was a World War II veteran. And where the mission was pretty clear. The mission in Vietnam was never clear. Let me talk about a couple key events. One is the ramp up to Vietnam really started in substantial numbers with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The ships Maddox and Turner Joy were attacked in the Tonkin Gulf. And the Congress, in the 7th of April of 1964, passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave the president almost unlimited authority to take action as he saw fit. Then there was a significant event in November 1965, which has largely gone unreported. And that had to do with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, for those of you that understand the military structure, Joint Chiefs of Staff are advisors to two entities. One is the President, and the other is the Secretary of Defense. In an unprecedented move, the Joint Chiefs of Staff asked for a private meeting to exclude the Secretary of Defense, private meeting with the President. This was in November of 1965. Those folks, five gentlemen, led by Earl Wheeler, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the other service chiefs, met with the President. And what they argued was, don't get into a land war in Vietnam. Don't get into a land war in Vietnam. If you want to punish the North Vietnamese for whatever, North Vietnam for whatever, use blockades, use air power, but don't get into a land war. Johnson basically threw him out of the office. According to Lieutenant General George Cooper, who was there, who was present in his book, he writes about this. He threw him out of the office using four-letter words, some of which had not been invented yet. So now one could argue, why didn't the Joint Chiefs resign out of that? That's a good question. Why didn't they? But anyway, the war proceeded. Because in 1965, they were convinced that we couldn't do what McNamara wanted to do. So again, I go back to the accountants, and I don't like to pick on accountants here because some I have association with. But the whiz kids, and who are the whiz kids? I'll name a couple. Alan Antolin, Les Aspin. Anybody ever hear of Les Aspin? Okay, Les Aspin was one of these guys. Okay, but everything was based on numbers. And so what it boiled down to is, as long as we can do a kill ratio that is 2.6 precisely, 2.6 of the bad guys to one of us, then we can grind them down. This led to the idea of body count, which was heavily inflated. I know, I was there. I did some of that. But that was the objective. Now think about it. If you know that the only strategy, the only objective here is to stay alive, lots of bad things can happen, and some did. Some did. It wasn't like in Desert Storm, where you had a clear objective. It wasn't like in World War II, where you had a clear objective. And then McNamara goes on in his book. He writes that he knew by 1965 that the war was unwinnable from a military perspective. He then goes on to say that he believed by simply treading water, neither winning nor losing, that we would somehow stop communism advancing. And in 1980, he admits it was all a big mistake. Well, 58,000 guys perished as a result of that. So I'm sure God can forgive him. I'm not sure I can. Whoops, I hit the wrong one. Now let me get a little bit personal here for a second. This is on the right is my commissioning class from Kansas State. And then a sort of a better picture of some of us real heroes on the other side here. It looks better at least. And we got the fourrière on, which says we're important at Kansas State. Of those guys, 4 would not come back. Most of us saw time in Vietnam. 4 would not come back. 1 was a POW. And one of the other guys survived Vietnam but died in the towers. And so that was kind of a testimony to our class out of Kansas State in 1967. Some of the key events that we participated in one fashion or another. Tet Offensive in '68. Walter Cronkite visited Vietnam in February of '68 and came back and said, even though we won the Tet Offensive, if you want to call it winning, he came back and reported that the war was lost. We couldn't win. Johnson then said, I've lost. Cronkite, we're going to lose the war, and he announced he would run. Nixon takes office. Peace with honor was the, yes sir?
Some people here may not know who Walter Cronkite is.
Yeah, everybody know who Walter Cronkite is? CBS News, Okay, thanks, Joel. Sometimes I forget, you know. But in 1969, we had 550,000 troops in Vietnam, and then we began the Vietnamization program to draw down, turn over to the Vietnamese. By 1971, we had less than 200,000 troops in Vietnam. What happened was the North Vietnamese invaded. And it was clear that the South Vietnamese army was not capable of defending. That's when we rolled air units back in. That's where I come into the picture, and many of my cohorts. And this is what's interesting, is I'm going to tell you some personal stories about all this now. On Operation Linebacker. Operation Linebacker, we threw air units back in. The guy out there with the red arrow is Roger Locker. Roger was a classmate of mine. He was now thrown back for his third tour in Vietnam. He'd survived the first two. The guy on the far right, on the bottom right-hand side, is Bob Lodge. That's the F-4 that they were flying. On May the 10th, 1972, they were shot down. Bob was killed. He never got out. Roger got out. Roger survived, evaded for 23 days. Evaded capture from North Vietnamese. He was 30 miles outside of Hanoi and near one of the major North Vietnamese air bases. We did everything we could to try to find Roger. We weren't sure if he was alive or captured or whatever, but we assumed he was still alive. We'd seen his shoot. His wingman had seen his shoot. What happened is on June the 1st, Steve Ritchie was flying a MiG-cap and heard Roger come up on the net. Roger very quietly said, "Hey guys, I've been down here a long time. You think you could pick me up?" We weren't sure it was Roger, because after 20-some days, he could have been compromised. You fill out one of these questionnaires that says, if I get caught, here's a question they ask me to verify that it's me. You know, you do that for whatever. Well, we figured it might have been a trick on the part of the North Vietnamese. Two very good friends of mine volunteered to fly into that danger zone. One was Ron Smith, there on the left, flying an A1. Said, "I'll go up and take a look on the 2nd of June. Take a look." Dale Stovall flew the helicopter, and they picked him up. Now, here's the bar thing, okay? We were asked, give us a question that only somebody who went to Kansas State would know. The question was, what's kites? So we asked Ron asked Roger the question, what's kites? He says, it's a damn bar in Aggieville, now get me the hell out of here. And there's Roger, 23 days later. And we basically shut down the air war to locate him and bring him back, which makes the point. We don't give up on anybody, which is why, and I think I speak for a lot of veterans here, the situation with Benghazi really bothers us. We flew 150 missions to try to locate Roger and get him back. And how many missions were flown to rescue those guys in Benghazi? Anyway, so then the question is, what do you do after you've been on the ground evading the bad guys for 23 days? Well, you have a course, of course. You know? That's the first thing you do, is you get a course. And so, anyway, excuse me. These are guys that gave up substantial portions of their life in Hanoi. The guy on the left, upper left, is Jeff Ellis. Jeff's a friend of mine. Jeff, one leg is 1.5 inches shorter than the other because of the brutality with which he was treated. He was a prisoner for 5.5 years. On the lower left there is Reg Tegeman. Rich was a prisoner for 5 years. On the upper right-hand side, John Furr. John was a prisoner for 6.5 years in Hanoi. The guy on the lower right is Bob Chrisman. Bob Certain. Bob, after he was released, became a minister and stayed in the Air Force as a minister. The guy in the middle was a classmate, Jim Latham. Jim was shot down and was a POW as well. He went on to become the commander of the Thunderbirds and retires as a One Star. He's doing great, and I saw him last summer. On March the 15th of 1966, on a armed reconnaissance mission in an F-4, this gentleman was shot down, and for 52 years, we never knew anything about him. He was carried initially as mission in action, then killed in action. And now, Colonel Peter Stewart is coming home. And I'm honored to have with me Jim Stewart, his son, one of 6 kids of Colonel Stewart's family, and his remains have been identified and will be flown into Tampa on the 16th of June, and there will be a Catholic funeral ceremony in Winter Haven on the 18th. And I'm honored to have Jim, his son, with me here today. Thanks, Jim. We don't let anybody behind, leave anybody behind if there's any way we can avoid it. I think I mentioned to you once before in one of my presentations, 10 days after Jim's dad was shot down, 10 days after, one of my very best friends from high school died. Lance Corporal Bill Copeland was 19 years old. He was nearing the end of his tour in Vietnam when he was killed. And that's a life-changing thing. I was a junior in college at the time when my mother called to tell me that Bill had been killed. And you look at the world a little different after that. It becomes very real to you. These are four of my classmates that didn't come home. And they're there. I will say this, that Mitch Lane is still missing. We don't know, no evidence have been found from Mitch yet, but these were guys that he went to school with, these were college with, these were guys that you saw every day, and these were guys that you trained with, and they're missed. To my college, I'm pleased to say at Kansas State, in a very prominent place on campus, they built their own wall for those from Kansas State that have been killed in Vietnam. There's 42 names on there, and I was fortunate to be the guest speaker at the dedication a number of years ago when that was done. And if you ever get to Kansas State, the best school in the world, visit the the Vietnam Memorial there, because in actuality, those that didn't come home are the real heroes.
There's teddy bears in high school rings, and old photographs that mamas bring, the daddies with their young boys playing ball. There's combat boots that he used to wear when he was sent over there. There's 50,000 names carved in the wall. There's cigarettes and there's cans of beer, notes that say I miss you, dear, and children who don't say anything at all. There's purple hearts and packs of gum, fatherless daughters and fatherless sons, and There's 50,000 names carved in the wall. They come from all across this land in pickup trucks and minivans, searching for a boy from long ago. They scan the wall and find his name. The teardrops fall like pouring rain. Then silently they leave a gift and go. They're stars of David and rosary beads and crucifixion figurines and flowers of all colors, large and small. There's a Boy Scout badge, an American, little American flags waving in the wind, and there's 50,000 names carved in the wall. There's 50,000 names carved in the wall.
Thank you, Gary. It goes without saying how grateful we are for your service and your perspective. And just thank you.